This is the Darcy Giroux Podcast, episode 52. Today our speaker is Per Bylund, and this is his talk from the 2023 Capitalism and Morality Calgary Seminar.
So thanks for having me. It's great to be here. It's good to see people in the flesh. It seems nowadays that people want to interact mostly. So it's great to see so many people here. Like Darcy mentioned, the topic of my talk is regulations and market process. Get back to that, but first, it's a little bit confusing here, and I don't mean Canada, but in the Danish-Canadian club with all the long ships and the Danish flags. Because as a Swede, I don't know if I'm supposed to feel at home or threatened. I'm not sure if you're aware, but Sweden and Denmark have been at war for like 800 years or something. So, anyway, the title is actually a bit problematic. And the reason for that is not the word destroy, which is the obvious part, but it's really regulations, which I think most people don't really understand, and market process, which most people also don't understand. So I'm going to take this time together and talk a little bit about those two, starting with the market process and how that impacts how we see the economy and how we can think about the economy. That is the title of my book, as Darcy mentioned. So when we study economics, we tend to learn it in terms of what I call the economist's gang sign. Have you ever seen that? Supply and demand. That's how economists, when you meet another economist, you go, and you know that you're on the same level, that sort of thing. But it's a static system, right? There's no change happening. And one of the things that I torture my students with in the beginning of my courses is, well, this is the economy. Point out where the entrepreneur is. Where is entrepreneurship? Where is change? Of course, it's a trick question, because there is none. It's a static system. Everything has already been sorted. Everything has already been settled. There's no change going on. Any change will necessarily take the system out of equilibrium, and then the analysis sort of fails. That's quite problematic if you're talking about the economy, because everybody knows, maybe economics professors, knows that the economy is constantly changing. And it's not changing simply because, well, it's a circular flow, as we sometimes teach it as well. It's not a circular flow. It grows and it shrinks. Businesses are born, businesses go out of business, new products are created and take over the world. It changes our behavior, all of those things. I can tell from the age in this room that a lot of you might recall the world before the smartphone. Smartphone changed the world. Everything is different, right? That doesn't really fit in the circular flow. It does not fit in a static system. Rather, it is something that is completely changing all the time, and we have to recognize this fact. Now, if the economy is a process, rather, it's unfolding and changing, and we don't really know what to expect from it, that changes a whole lot about how we see the economy and how to think about the world itself. You can call it a process of creative destruction, where things come and go. It's not creative destruction in the sense that, oh yeah, we need to destroy something in order to create something, but the other way around. The smartphone is, again, a good example of this, where Apple launched the first smartphone. You recall before, we had the flip phones, right? Many of you had a flip phone before. I did. And they competed with the new generations of flip phones. They were smaller and smaller and smaller. My last one was this big. It had a beautiful 1-inch color display. Of course, you had to punch 7 4 times to get a freaking S when you texted someone. But, I mean, you recall this. And smaller, and eventually you would think that a company would launch this phone that was so small you couldn't even find it. It would be like the pinnacle of innovation. Then Steve Jobs launched this big-ass phone, the first iPhone. Now, it was not a very good phone because you couldn't really place many phone calls on it. You couldn't rely on it for phone calls. Later generations, sure. But it was really big instead. It completely changed. And all the businesses, Samsung, and recall Nokia, Finnish company? Nobody could beat Nokia, right? Their phones, they were number one in the world. How can you compete with a company like that? Or Sears Roebuck? How can you compete with, oh yeah, basically gone. So obviously the economy is not a static system. It's not a circular flow. It's changing. And we change with it, it changes us, and so forth. Now, in this system, entrepreneurship is the driving force, as Mises put it. And as an entrepreneurship professor, I like to say this a lot. It attracts students to my courses, and it gives me a higher salary and things like that. But the thing is that entrepreneurship really is the driving force of the economy. It is what creates those things. Apple and Steve Jobs were doing entrepreneurship when they launched the iPhone. They were changing things, creating something new that they had no idea whether people would actually accept. It's not as simple as saying that, well, we just survey people and ask them what they want, and then we'll just do it. Of course, if you could do that, then anyone can do a survey. You can just ask people, what should I do? And then you start a business and you make a killing. Well, other people might learn that that's how you do it. That's not how you do it. Really, really hard to be an entrepreneur, and for good reason. But that's also something that we don't consider when we talk about the economy. We forget that part. And Danny put it well, production precedes consumption. Now, in some sense, this is an obvious point. Of course, you have to sort of bake the bread before you eat it. Everybody understands this. Well, it's also the case that you have to put the whole machinery, the whole business, the whole supply chain in place before there can be any bread. The same thing with all inventions. You have to make all these investments before you can even launch the product. And people don't even know if they want the product until they see it. You can't ask people what they want because they don't really know what they want. But they know if they want it when you have it. Well, then it's too late. Then you might have already invested millions or even billions into producing the thing that they don't want. Now that sucks. That's not good at all. So this is a quote that I use a lot. It's Henry Ford. Apparently he never actually said these words. But awesome quote. I'm going to use it anyway. But it sort of pinpoints the problem of entrepreneurship. Because he said, well, he didn't say, but yeah, bear with me. If I had asked people what they wanted, they would have said faster horses. And that's exactly the problem. He was not going to horse breeding. That was not his line of business, right? He wanted to produce something else. Had he told people, you know what, I'm thinking of producing a horse and carriage without the horse. Would you be interested? They would say, lunatic, madman right here, where are the authorities? Because people couldn't even envision what that might be like. They couldn't understand, and they definitely didn't understand why they would want such a thing. How could it move? Whatever. Right? Ford was not the inventor of the automobile. He was the innovator of the automobile. Now the difference there is that the inventor is the creator of something new, but the innovator is the creator of something and making it valuable to people. There were automobiles before Henry Ford. Plenty of them. None was a success at all. Henry Ford had a different vision, not only skipping the faster horses bit, but creating an automobile that people could afford. So producing it in a certain way so that he could keep the cost down, so that he could offer it at a low price, so that a lot of people could afford getting the carriage without the horse. So innovation is what entrepreneurs do. Invention is something else. very often you have successful entrepreneurs who are innovators, who create something new that changes the world, but the new is really the new value, not the new thing. Very often they copy the thing and they just repackage it. They change the messaging, they change the communication, and there are people go, oh, okay, I get it. And then it's of value to people. Whereas the first guy who invented the thing never really got it, never really understood how it could satisfy people, how it could bring value to people. And we see this a lot if you consider universities. There are plenty of inventions in universities. Now, if universities really suck at something, well, they suck at a lot, but there's one thing that I have in mind right now. They suck at innovating. You have all these professors, really smart people, and they do all these experiments. They invent all these new things, especially in engineering colleges and things like that. They figure out new ways of doing things, new types of materials, things like that. They never really figure out how to sell it. They never figure out how this can change people's lives. So they can't really build a business around it. Universities usually have incentive programs. Try to get these people in the ivory towers to actually sell it to people. Doesn't matter. Doesn't work. So usually you have an entrepreneur, a businessman, seeing something, stealing or buying the rights to it, making it into a product. Much of what Apple did back in the day. If you recall, Steve Jobs went to Xerox Labs and thought, oh, what is this? Graphical user interface. Whoa, what is this? A mouse? Wow, we could use this. They had not thought of it. They were inventors. Steve Jobs was innovator. It's like, well, I can package this. This is much easier to use. So I'll just take those ideas. And of course, Bill Gates did the same. He took those ideas from Steve Jobs and produced his own version. That's innovation. It brings the value to people, makes it useful and valuable. Of course, that's going to change the world. All right, so what entrepreneurs do then is, yeah, they compete, but usually we tend to think about how they compete within already existing markets, right? They created another grocery store, and they try to take customers from the existing ones. Or they create a new automobile manufacturing business, and they try to take customers from the existing ones. Well, this is not really super innovative. It doesn't really change the world a lot. It just changes who you buy from. But it doesn't really change the economy much. Because from the economist's perspective and from consumers' perspective, who cares if there are 30 or 32 producers of this one thing? We don't. It doesn't change much at all. A new grocery store might have nicer colors. It might be easier to find things. Might be a little closer to where you live. Still a grocery store. It doesn't change anything. So that's not really it. But what entrepreneurs typically do as a function in the economy, and if you study Austrian economics, sort of get this after a while, but it's never really stated very explicitly. But it's all there in what Mises called the economic calculation problem of socialism. I mean, that the future is uncertain, and because production precedes consumption, you have to make an investment, put all the production facilities and production processes in place, cover the costs of them, or you can launch something and hope that it will make sense to consumers and they will buy it. Now, by doing this, you have to envision the value that you're creating. So entrepreneurs, they have in mind that, well, this is going to change the world, as most of them think, but they also put a number at it. Say, well, I think I can sell this many at this price, and I'm pretty darn sure. And then they look around, how can I produce this thing at a value that is lower than the revenue I expect? Not the other way around. Well, some people do it the other way around, and they typically fail. Most entrepreneurs fail most of the time, and I think the main reason is that they do it the wrong way. They don't really understand economics, real economics, Austrian economics. Because what they do is they think, oh, I have this great product that I want to produce, Then they calculate, okay, how much does it cost to produce this thing according to my own specifications, what I think the product should be, and then add a markup, some percentage of profit that you want, and then you open the store and you go, I'm here, come and get the stuff. Well, that's a great way of failing. That's not how you should do, because you have no idea whether people actually will value it. You should start the other end, which Austrian economics does. Economics, in a sense, is always backwards. It starts with the consumer. Does the consumer actually value what I have in mind? How much do they value it? And then, based off of that, you choose your costs. So when entrepreneurs start a business, what they should do is think, okay, this is my revenue. How do I produce something that, first of all, maximizes the revenue, but keeps the cost below the revenue so that I can make a profit? I get something in between. By doing that, all entrepreneurs are competing for the factors, for the employees, for the land, for the capital, the machinery, and so forth, based off of the value that they think they're going to produce. They could be wrong, sure. But that's the basis for their calculus. And by doing this, they establish prices of those things. So the market wage is based off of what entrepreneurs think that people can contribute to the bottom line, not the other way around. Which is super important if you think about it, because this means that the prices of factors in the economy are based off of all entrepreneurs competing with their visions. Of course, they're betting their own money on this, so they're not just going for whatever. They're actually pretty careful, because they can lose everything if they're wrong. This is what Mises meant when he said that socialism cannot work, because you need all of these entrepreneurs involved in this bidding process to establish these prices. If the state owns everything, there's no bidding at all. Well, in socialism, they also don't care about consumers. So there are plenty of problems, right? But the real issue is trying to get resources, put them in production now, to maximize the value outcome later. That's an enormous problem. And there's one solution, and it's the open or free market. Now, Mises put it this way: profits are the driving force of the market economy. The greater the profits, the better the needs of the consumers are supplied. He who serves the public best makes the highest profit. But it makes the profits after the fact. Profits are not there to begin with. It's not a matter of simply comparing revenues and costs. That's what accountants do after the fact. But what you do as an entrepreneur is you envision how much value you can actually create for people, that they will actually buy the stuff for a certain amount, and then figure out, how am I supposed to produce this so that I can keep the cost low enough to make a buck myself? And that drives the economy. Profits is what they're going for. Profits is what most entrepreneurs do not get. If you look at the statistics, entrepreneurs as a group typically make less than employees as a group. So profits, great if you get them, but most people do not. So in the market economy overall, customer is king. Because the customer always decides whether something is of value or not. And the poor entrepreneurs, they've already invested everything. They already put in place businesses. They already hired people. They paid their wages. They signed contracts with suppliers. They did all these things before they know whether they can buy anything. Of course, this is not merely the problem of figuring out, can I produce something that people value? Also, can I produce something that people value more than what others are producing that I know nothing about? There are thousands and thousands of people thinking right now about how can they contribute value to consumers in the future with all these new ideas, new ways of doing things, new things to do, whatever it might be, which means entrepreneurs are really in the business of creating our tomorrow. Tomorrow will not be like today because they're going to disrupt it. That's what they're going for, all of them, in small ways or big ways. Most of them fail, but as part of the process, resources get allocated toward their highest valued uses. So when Mises says that the consumer is sovereign in the market economy, that's what he means. He has this weird discussion in Human Action where he talks about how the entrepreneur is not the captain of the ship, but the consumer is, or something like that. The entrepreneurs steer the ship, but they follow the captain's orders. It's a beautiful example of an analogy that doesn't quite make sense. Because it avoids the time issue, right? The captain would tell the person steering the ship after the fact whether he steered it well or not. That's how the market process actually works. It's not the case that the captain directs and then someone steers the ship following those orders. No, you steer the ship and then the captain says, that's not the harbor where we were going. You should be over here, not there. Idiot. Right? That's how the consumer determines the market and decides everything in the market. Now, how do we study this thing that is open-ended and uncertain? Well, obviously not this. Because there's no uncertainty, no entrepreneurship, no innovation, nothing like that in there. So as an Austrian economist, I use the step-by-step method, Mises called it. And this is important to realize what it is and how to use it, because otherwise we tend to end up in the wrong place. And it's no biggie if you do end up in the wrong place. A lot of very smart people have. However, we should be better, those smart people. So let's do an example of this. We'll see if... So these are two of the smart people that I mentioned that were completely wrong in their analysis. You might have heard of them, David Hume and John Stuart Mill. Now, if they can be wrong, it's no biggie if we are wrong too. However, we can be better than they are. So in an example that they had and that they used, that both Mises and Rothbard referred to, said, well, the number of money around and prices are related. If there's more money, there should be higher prices overall and so forth. Now, in an experiment, just hypothetically, what if we would double the amount of cash in the economy overnight? What would happen? Now, there are different ways you can answer this, of course. One would be, well, all prices would be doubled tomorrow. Or they might need a little time to adjust, but eventually they will all double. Or, nah, they wouldn't double. Well, let's do a little poll and see if you are just as stupid as Hume and Mill. So, how many of you say that the prices would double right away? Okay, so you're not. Okay, how many of you would say that, yeah, eventually they would all double? How many of you would say that, nah? Okay, so I'm not going to call you out or anything. Don't worry. So here's the thing, with the step-by-step method, it changes the analysis. Because to Hume and Mill, well, this number of money and tomorrow double, obviously the prices are going to be about the same. People want the same things and so forth, so all the prices are going to double. Well, let's jump into conclusions. That's not the way to do this. Instead, you need to think about is human action. How would people react if we all wake up tomorrow morning and our cash is doubled? So you look in your wallet and you had 20 bucks. Whoops, 40. Where did that come from? Or you check your checking account balance and you had $13 and now suddenly you have 26. So whatever cash you had, it's doubled. How many are going to say, I'm going to buy exactly the same thing. I'm going to do exactly the same thing as last time, yesterday? Probably not. And the thing is that those people waking up early, they're better off than those waking up late, because they can go to the store first, right? So in my case, I wake up at 5 every morning. So if I would see that, oh, look at that, I have $40 instead of 20, I might just rush to Walmart and buy everything I can. Probably not, but I could. Right? What about the grocer and the businessmen? Would they wake up that morning and say, look at that, my cash has doubled. I'm going to go to the store and change all the prices of all my products that I'm selling. Of course not. They're not going to do that. Even if they figure that, maybe everybody has doubled their cash, they're still going to think, well, I bought this for $10, I'm selling it for 20. Why would I sell it for 40? And how can I count on people actually paying double prices suddenly? Because it's still in dollars, right? Nothing else. So they're not going to change their prices. Someone might. And what's going to happen when someone, say the first customer for the day, goes to the grocery store, he has his shopping list, and he looks at in his wallet and goes, whoa, look at that. More cash than I thought. Okay, well, he was going to pick up sausages or something like that for dinner. Well, I can afford the filet, so why not pick up filet instead? A lot of people prefer filet to sausages. And he can afford it now because he has a lot more cash. So, of course, buy filet. The next guy comes in and weirdly is also hunting for sausages. And he sees the same prices. Well, he's going to go for the filet too. And maybe the next one as well. Grocer's going to, why? Wow, everybody's buying filet. What the heck is this? So what is he going to do? Eventually, someone is going to increase the price of filet, and is probably going to start by placing an order from his supplier for more filet. What is he going to do with the sausages? He's going to lower the price of the sausages because he needs to sell the freaking thing. And he's probably going to place a call to the supplier of sausages saying, I don't need another delivery right now. I have a bunch of sausages. Typically, grocers are pretty good at figuring out what people want because it's basically the same. It doesn't change a whole lot. But in this case, it did. Of course, they're going to change their actions too. Well, what do we have then? We suddenly have the price of filet going up, the price of sausages going down. So the relative prices, the relative cost for people buying filet versus sausages, very different from before. How many of you think that they're going to adjust to being exactly the same relation as before? Well, why would they? People have changed their behavior. Some people think that, well, look at this. Filet is actually pretty good. Just like people have said, I'm going to go for filet from now on. And some people are going to say, sausages are cheaper, I'm going to go with that, and then I can save for my kids' college education or whatever. People change their behaviors based off of the prices, and prices change based off of their behavior. So the economy has changed overall. Of course, prices are not going to go back to being exactly what they were. So human will are necessarily wrong. Of course, as an abstraction, macroeconomists, I hate to call them economists, but they tend to use aggregates, right? So they say the price level. So never mind if filet goes up and sausage goes down because the price level is the same, sort of. So they will say that, well, the price level will go up or double or whatever. But that doesn't mean anything because no one is reacting to the price level. We react to individual prices and to our situation. Just like the guys entering the grocery store choosing filet over sausages. Because the filet is, relatively speaking, relative to their cash, much cheaper. They're going to go for what they value more. Pretty easy. When you think about it, it's pretty obvious. So why do all economists do this wrong? It's a good question. Okay, so now that we have a little understanding for the method and also how the economy works, let's get to regulations. Because now you know the market process, how that works. It's really hard to predict what it's like or what it's going to be like. Because it's based off of billions of people and their actions. It's going to, and also entrepreneurs guessing what people might value in the future. It's really hard. Now, regulations are not easy. They're easy if you assume, because then you can just add a little cost here, add a little little subsidy there, and then you would estimate that people would shift their behavior from sausages to filet. Well, people don't really react like that. Right? So you can't really do that. Now, first of all, we need to recognize that what a regulation is. People tend to think of regulations as the promise of it. So they think of minimum wage laws as raising people's wages. That's not really what it does. Right? The government can't write a law saying that everybody should produce more value or everybody should get more value. That's not how it works. A regulation is always a restriction imposed on people's behavior. It's never anything else. The government cannot give, it can only take. It can only limit, only restrict, only impose extra costs. So if they want you to do this, well, they can either pay you to do that by taking other people's money first, or they can force you not to do the other thing. Which means there are two different kinds of regulations. One that is ineffective because it doesn't change anyone's behavior. It's like setting the minimum wage law to say that you cannot hire anyone full-time at less than zero. Yeah, well, most of us don't work for zero, so it's not going to change a thing. It has no impact whatsoever because all salaries are higher than zero. That's an ineffective regulation. An effective regulation would be to say, well, minimum wage should be $150 an hour. Now that's going to change things, right? That's going to cause a difference in the world because most people don't make $150 an hour. So it's going to change. It's going to have an effect on the economy. Of course, all regulations seek to have effects on the economy. The whole point of a regulation is to be effective, to make sure that the economy changes, that your behavior changes by imposing costs or prohibitions on certain things. So keep that in mind. Some regulations turn out to be ineffective, but they're all trying to be effective, which means they're all trying to be restrictions. They're always trying to change things by making sure you don't do that, and therefore you might do the other thing. Okay, so what does that mean then? Well, it means that if you have a regulation saying that you should not do this, or this is illegal, or this comes at a higher cost, or whatever it might be, it means that entrepreneurs cannot pursue that thing, right? It means if you say that, well, you cannot produce a big phone without buttons, because we need to make sure that all phones are small enough to carry and that you have real buttons so you can actually enter a phone number. Well, that means there would be no smartphone, because an entrepreneur can't produce that sort of phone because they're not allowed to. Or they have to pretend that, oh, well, you can place phone calls on it, but it's not really your phone. It's something else. And so they can play that game trying to make the regulation ineffective with respect to what they're producing. Uber did this, for instance, right? It's basically a taxi service, and they made sure to call them not a taxi service, because if they were a taxi service, then they would suffer the same regulations as all the taxi services, which would be impossible. You couldn't compete with them, right? Then you need a call center, you need to buy a bunch of cars, and then, well, you need to make sure that the cars are pretty nasty and that the drivers aren't nice and things like that, right? So instead, they say, well, this is a ride sharing. And we're just really matching people who want to drive with people who want to ride. Okay. Can you swipe left and right on the drivers too? But by doing that, they claimed that they were not regulated by whatever was regulating the taxi business, right? They were sidestepping the regulations. In a sense, they were innovating, right? But what they were really doing was providing a better type of taxi service, this personal transportation. Now, if entrepreneurs can't go here, if they didn't want to go there, if they thought that they could not produce value over here for people, and you regulate that they can't, it's an ineffective regulation, right? But if entrepreneurs actually want to go here and want to produce this thing for consumers, and you regulate that so that they cannot, that's an effective regulation. Well, what are you actually doing then? Well, then you're telling entrepreneurs, no, you cannot, even though you think that you can satisfy consumers doing this. So you cannot serve consumers in this way, which, because they were going to choose it, is the best way that they could think of to serve consumers. The highest value that they could create, right? But since they cannot, they will do something else. They might not start a business, or they will start a business doing something else. But that's something else that is in their mind of lower value than they otherwise would have chosen. Otherwise, they would have chosen that instead. Right? So the regulation will cause entrepreneurs to pursue a lower value for consumers. There can be many arguments for this, right? But in general, it is because politicians, they see a public good that they think is more important than consumer good. Right? Consumers should not decide for themselves if entrepreneurs want to go there. Instead, we should decide because this is not good. That's what they're making. That's an effective regulation, right? So you're not going to get then investments over here. You're going to get investments somewhere else. So the resources are no longer pursuing the highest value, potentially, for consumers. It's being invested in other lines of production, producing lesser value for consumers, which of course gives you not only other products in the market, but also different careers. Because no longer will entrepreneurs hire people over here. They will hire people over here instead. No longer will they buy and develop machinery and things like that over here, where they thought there was a lot of value. Instead, they will do it over here. You will get a completely different structure of the economy. One regulation is all it takes to completely distort how the economy works and where the market process is going. Now, that's why I tend to say that even libertarians don't really understand how destructive regulations are. Because all it takes is one. Just regulate a little bit, distort the whole thing, and the outcome is completely different. It doesn't mean, of course, that we will all be poor if there's one regulation, or it doesn't matter if there's one regulation or a billion. Yeah, it matters. But the structure of the economy is distorted by regulations being in place at all, if they're effective. Okay? Now, what you're really doing when you're regulating the market is overriding consumer sovereignty. I said the customer is king. The customer is the final arbiter of whether the entrepreneur has done something right or wrong. Consumers still choose whether to buy or not buy something that is offered, sure. But what is being offered? Different because of regulations. So no longer do consumers freely get to choose from what entrepreneurs freely have chosen to produce. Instead, something else is being produced that has probably, according to entrepreneurs anyway, lower value, and consumers get to choose that lower value thing instead. Now this is obviously problematic because if you think about how entrepreneurs really react on and build off of what previous entrepreneurs have done, because the economy and innovations are cumulative, right? A new type of innovation is typically based on previous innovation and previous invention. It's just, they tweak it a little bit and they figure out how to do it. Just like Henry Ford did with the Model T. Not another handmade car. Instead, no, let's produce 1 billion of these cars right away, all of the same color, all look exactly the same, but keep them affordable. That was his innovation, not the car itself. Who knows, it might not have been the best car. Definitely not the most beautiful or the most high quality or whatever. No, it was the most affordable, and that is something that consumers chose. Now, if entrepreneurs can't pursue these things, and you just have one regulation, the next generation of entrepreneurs are going to react on what was successful before and add to it. Add innovation to whatever the level was before. Well, what does that actually mean? Well, it means not only that the distortion you caused with one regulation one time it's actually repeated the next generation of innovations, and the next, because the structure of the economy is distorted. It no longer follows where entrepreneurs believe that the highest value for consumers might be. It's based on something else. Second, third, fourth, 150th highest value, whatever it might be. They're going where they can go, and other entrepreneurs are building off of their successes, what they figured out, also going where they can go, which means a minor regulation will have enormous effects over time. So that's the last point here, that we will have a lower overall value created trajectory. Which simply just means that no, economic growth will be much lower for the foreseeable future, and for as long as we have regulations in place that are effective. So it's not the case as many economists, when they do their analysis of a regulation, they look at, well, the seen and the unseen. You've all probably read Bastiat, or at least you know the expression. Or you've heard of Paul Krugman, who is the exact opposite. The broken window fallacy, he tends to like that fallacy. He commits it a lot. Now, it's not only the seen and the unseen, because it also over time, because it's cumulative. It changes what careers are available, it changes what other innovations are available, and totally changes what you have to choose from. What products do we not have today that we would have had to choose from? How rich would we be today were it not for regulations? So, in a sense, why aren't we going on holiday on, I don't know, Europa, Jupiter's moon? Right? Well, because we can't technologically, and it's too expensive and all this stuff. Well, would we have been able to without regulations? Potentially. Because the economy is expanding really fast, right? You might have seen the graph with people's standard of living going like this, and then past couple of 100 years. That's with regulations. And imagine if it was without regulations. If this actually built off of itself. Maybe we would have been not here, but on Europa instead. Now, I've never been, so I don't know if it's a great place or not, but I call this the unrealized in a previous book of mine, just going through what would their outcome be like, and what is the economy like. It changes a lot. And an example I used in that book is the sweatshop. Now, you have probably heard of the seen and the unseen, those two arguments. The seen is that people work in these sweatshops and terrible working conditions. Compared to us, it's low salaries, they're being used or exploited, those things, right? That's what the left would claim. And then you have the right claiming, well, they don't have any other options. So either they toil in the fields, they starve, maybe prostitution is an option, or the sweatshop. The reason people line up whenever a sweatshop is opened, because those jobs are so much better and they make so much more money in the sweatshop. It's a good thing, right? Well, hold on. Why is there only one sweatshop in this place? How come there are not 2 or 3 or 4 in the same place competing for the workers? Wouldn't then workers be paid a little more? Wouldn't they have better working conditions? Of course they would, because the employers would compete for them. So how come there's only one? What is stopping others from starting their own sweatshops, from competing and making this, wherever this might be, a poor country somewhere, making it better for all the people there? How come their economic growth, in a sense, has stopped, or is not going very quickly? Well, it's because of a regulation somewhere, probably on international trade or something like that. But that is what has stifled economic growth. So the unrealized isn't simply, well, we could go to Europa or whatever, but we're not really missing it because we don't know anything about it. Well, it's also what's keeping people poor and keeping people from careers where they would be really happy and really rich and would be able to serve people in a much, much better way. So this is much, much more important than we realize. Hence, even libertarians don't understand how destructive regulations are, because we tend not to, because they really are disastrous. So thinking the right way about the economy, really recognizing that it is a process and it is unfolding over time, and that entrepreneurship is the driving force, but that the consumer is king, the consumer is sovereign, is how to understand what the impact of the state, the impact of regulations, the impact of policy, and it's much, much, much worse than you might imagine. And that's sort of the reason why I wrote my latest book, as Darcy mentioned, How to Think About the Economy, which was, the intention was to write a new economics in one lesson. You've probably heard of Hazlitt's Classic, right? Well, the problem with Hazlitt's Classic is that it really is one lesson. But economics is so much more. So in a discussion with former Mises Institute president Jeff Deist, we realized that we need something that is much more of an overview to give people economic literacy, to figure out how the economy works, not just that one lesson, but all of it. Business cycles, what the heck's the role of money, all of those things in one book. But it needs to be short, it needs to be simple, it needs to be cheap, so that people can actually read and understand it. So Jeff told me that, well, keep it at a maximum of half the length of economics in one lesson. And I was like, yeah, great. But I actually managed to keep it under half the length. So it's really, really short, and the target audience for it is sort of someone's grandma. So I wanted, whether I'm successful, you'll be the judge of that. But the point was to write a book that is so simple to understand and get a grasp of economics overall, and you can read it in just a few hours. It's so simple that you can give it to your grandma, and your grandma should be able to understand it. That's the goal. And of course, cheap, it is cheap. You can get it for $5. Or the Mises Institute, and the Mises Institute does not believe in copyright and intellectual property, so it's all for free too, if you wish. So you can download it at the link there. It's a PDF file or it's an EPUB. There's also the audiobook, it's also free. So just download it, spam your friends, just spread the word, because the world really needs economic literacy. Thank you. I'll be happy to take your questions if you have any.
Okay, I would just like to say, anybody who has a question, I am going to ask that you use the mic so we make sure we capture it into the audio.
So I have a question that's about, we are on the verge of a new change from horses and car. So how do you teach about artificial intelligence, risk of ethics committee, or trying to regulate?
So artificial intelligence, it's well, I do have some opinions on that. I do experience artificial intelligence too, simply because suddenly the essays that my students write are really good. And that's sort of a good way of figuring out who is cheating. Because usually there are spelling errors, grammatical errors, and the logic is so-so, or it's good, but suddenly it's like really nice. But I'm not sure that is actually artificial intelligence, because that's based on a large language model. So it's really an engine that is good at mimicking how human beings communicate, right? I think a real artificial intelligence would be creative and be able to think in new ways and make progress. And I think this is rather looking backwards, copying what was. And you can tell I've been using the ChatGPT implementation in Bing, the search engine. And sometimes it's really great, and it offers references and all this stuff, but it also makes stuff up. Because it tells you what should be, statistically speaking, a good answer. Whether it's actually factual That's a different matter. So I asked it once for a quote that I know that this Nobel laureate said something along the lines of whatever. So I asked it, where is this quote? Can you find it? Because I didn't know exactly the quote and I didn't know exactly where to find it. I knew the author, but that doesn't really help a whole lot. And I get a nice answer saying, yes, this Nobel laureate said, and then quotation marks, and I was like, wow, that's exactly what I was looking for. And then there was a reference. I was like, that's almost a little too good to be true. So I clicked the reference, and yeah, there was a reference to this Nobel laureate saying something, but saying something else. So apparently this was a quote that never happened, much like the Henry Ford quote. So maybe I could use it after all. With a reference that didn't actually fit with what was stated. So, I mean, I hesitate to call it artificial intelligence for that reason. But from my perspective as an economist, artificial intelligence is really just technology. It's really just what we call capital, right? Like machines or whatever. So regulating it or licensing who can do it and things like that, of course, it's going to have the same impact as any other regulation. It means that you will have development somewhere else, you will have resources invested somewhere else where they will do less good, so we will all lose out. I don't see it as much of a threat. I hope that's even a little bit close to your question.
Just a quick curiosity relating to your comment on like the drag of regulation is kind of what I picked up there for entrepreneurial activity. And it's difficult to ask it correctly, so I'm going to try hard because I don't want to end up in taxation. But like the quantitative pull in the wrong direction, we'll call it, if it was allowed to be a bit more free, for lack of a better word, is there any statistical, or just across North America or just in the US, is there actually kind of data that you would consider reputable in that analysis?
Are you looking for statistics for the unrealized?
It is a tricky question, isn't it? In a zoom up level to, say, we look at jurisdictional restrictions and areas that may have less than more, is there any data maybe that way that helps add fuel to that sort of query?
I'm not sure. The problem with this is that the whole economy is cumulative, right? So a regulation over here might seem like that it has no effect on these entrepreneurs over here. Well, I mean, through this guy here and through this investment and through that, and they're actually related, right? So you can't really separate two jurisdictional areas or look at it different times or anything like that, because regulations are going to have an enormous effect. And you're comparing it with what might have been the case without, which of course is super hard. You can do it theoretically as sort of a narrative or a story, as I do in my previous book, just to show that the logic of it, how much we're actually missing out on. But data-wise, I mean, data is looking at the past, and the unrealized is about the future. And it's about the future in the past too, right? So since they were creating the future for generations, those futures never happened. And how are you going to capture that in data? That's super hard.
You would permit me one more quick add-on?
Sure.
In your experience, any actions that the individual can take to frustrate regulation?
Are you asking me to condone illegal behavior?
Paint the corners?
Well, I mean, I'm all for Uberification, right? So I don't think we should expect politicians to deregulate. I don't think we should expect businesses to ask for deregulation unless it's specific deregulation for themselves so that they get an upper hand on the competition, right? That's also why they ask for regulation. So I think the only way we're going to get deregulation is, well, either the state implodes completely. I'm all in favor of too. But other than that, I think it's simply entrepreneurship, doing something like Uber, sidestepping the regulations, inventing something that is a different category. If you recall, when Uber started launching their services in different cities, the politicians and bureaucrats and regulators freaked out. Right? They didn't know what to do because this is not something we voted on. What is this? Right? So I was a grad student in Columbia, Missouri, when Uber launched their service in Columbia. And of course, there was a board regulating taxi and personal transportation. Who was on the board? Well, the existing taxi companies. Right? So they were, we can't accept this because this is an unregulated space. So Uber said, okay, well, screw this. We'll just offer the service for free until you've decided on something. Because you can't regulate free. Well, they still made it illegal. And the police used smartphones to get Uber cab. And then they arrested the drivers for, well, basically selling a taxi service without being properly regulated or licensed. Right? But the thing is that they completely freaked out because these entrepreneurs were offering something that they couldn't quite understand and didn't know how to regulate. And there was not time to regulate them properly, quote unquote, using the slow machinery of democracy. But of course, it's amazing how fast they can be want to claim more power. But
Hi. Afternoon.
yeah, but there's no one that regulates more harsh way than the market itself. Right? Imagine a business building a building that then falls apart. If it's according to the government's code, you can say, well, it was according to code, and then you're safe. If there is no code, it doesn't matter how well you do it, you need to know what you're doing, because if it falls down, and especially if it hurts people, you're out of business. Yeah, very true, but you also lose everything you invested, right? And in competition with other businesses, well, then it would be a good idea for you to produce buildings that don't fall apart, right? Some buildings do fall apart, some buildings do not, I mean, with or without code. I think the harshest regulator is the consumer, especially over time.
Hi. Thanks for your presentation. Just want to ask a question. I don't know if you are aware of this, that season of election period right now. As at the time I check, federal government healthcare just for the 1 year. One of the areas that is highly regulated is healthcare system. Yet we're not getting value for that money budgeted. Now, if you listen to the campaign, the politician giving these urges of promises that, oh, they want to cut wait time for patients to see doctors, surgery, whatever procedure anybody wants, even though budgeted about 4 billion just for 1 year. Now, the question is that, can't our government, people that we elected, look into cause of why people had to wait for such a long time? Because there is not enough doctors. And it's because of these over-regulations. And the cartel behind this are the colleges that government set up, regulated. Now, I have a friend, she went to see the doctor about 1 month ago. Had issue with the breast. Now, she had to go to Colombia to get the procedure done, though they gave him 1 year to wait to see a doctor. Now, what can an average citizen do to bring this to the attention of our politicians? They are clueless about why we have this long wait, even though we have so much money budgeted for that.
Well, I don't think it matters if you bring it to the attention of politicians, because the political apparatus benefits from it being this way, right? Because it means that the politicians and regulators are needed to fix the problem, just like you're requesting. But if the problem disappears, they're not needed anymore, right? So it's actually a good thing for them if you have to wait for a very long time, even better if people die while awaiting surgery, because that means that, well, we need more power, we need to do something about this, and we need more money to give to these hospitals, and especially the bureaucrats, so that we can get more output. The government typically operates under the assumption that it's a scarcity of inputs that reduces the output. But it's not. All of history we've seen that we get more and more out of less and less. That's what entrepreneurs do. The governments, they just give more and more inputs to any organization or any type of operation. And how strangely the output going down. Especially compared to, relative to the inputs. Get less and less for the money, which to them just means that obviously it costs so much, so we need to give them even more money. And then we need to regulate a little more. The solution is the opposite. So what you're requesting is really to ask the politicians to step back and give back a little more of their power. That's not really their incentive. There's no reason for them to do this. So I think that healthcare is a good example. There are some industries that are so overly regulated that there's hardly any innovation happening. And you can see that because they do things in the same way they've done things for hundreds of years. Healthcare is one. Higher ed is one. When I go to work and I teach, I do it exactly the same way as the monks in the 1400s. That's innovation, right? No, it's not. Nothing has happened. And the reason is that that industry is protected. So the best way would be to deregulate, but no one is going to do that. Instead, we're going to have to wait for some Uberification of those industries. I think it's coming. Airlines is another example, where someone is going to innovate something that is going to completely disrupt the industry and change things.
Okay, we'll have one more question while they're still setting up lunch.
Thank you so much for the lovely lecture. I enjoyed it. Big fan of. Thank you so much for that. I had a quick question with regards to your statement you made that as a group, entrepreneurs tend to make lesser money than the employees. Is that a research base? Because that would kind of negatively impact the credibility of the entrepreneur.
Yes, so there's research showing that the average income for entrepreneurs overall is slightly lower than the average income for employees. But the thing is that what actually motivates most entrepreneurs is not income. It is such things as being your own boss or changing the world, things like that, right? So the biggest area of study within entrepreneurship is so-called social entrepreneurship. Because people believe for some reason that in order to change the world, you can't make profits. So therefore, they're interested in social entrepreneurship because then you can help the poor, and then you can change society, you can save the environment and things like that. Of course, it's even better if you can do that in a way that people value, that they're willing to pay for it. That's also going to attract other investments, and you're going to create a enormous change in that area, right? So calling it social is just silly. And the driving force of entrepreneurs themselves rarely profit because they have a vision. Some of them do make a lot of money, that's sure, right? But they want to travel to space, or they want to provide everyone with a carriage without horses, or whatever it might be. Changing the world is the typical motivation for it. Thank you.